The reality might be different.
I'll try not to have a food coma.
Not all.
Have a food coma.
Yeah, okay.
Parking Nazi, he now works at Nancy.
Anyways, now stay.
So I've been singing Barbara's praises here for a while, both at the last face-to-face and at this face-to-face. She's a partner with Stoll Reeves downtown and is, as far as I know, the Stoll Reeves experts on medical staff issues and medical compliance issues. And you've seen her extensive CV, professional honors and activities, presentations. I don't yet have this. She keeps presenting to my class and on her CV here, but maybe it's on there. Is it on there?
Yeah.
Various groups? There
No,
we
down
go.
below.
Oh, it is there! I looked right past it. That's great. I can contribute to your CV. That's wonderful. And she happens to have been at Stanford at the same time I was at Stanford.
Go Indians.
Yeah, right. I told my son that it was the Stanford Indians at one time. He didn't believe me. That was a long time ago. Yeah. So, welcome and thank you for coming.
So I've done this a few times now, and what I've learned is that there are a lot of people in the class who have had interesting experiences that relate to some things that we're going to talk about. And even though this is a bigger group, it's much more fun for me if you guys will speak up or ask questions as we go along. This is a long time for one person to talk. So, we've had a number of people offer observations and experiences related to some things in the healthcare regulatory area that they personally have that I found very interesting, and I know that other people in the group did too. So I just encourage you, if you have an observation or an experience you want to share when we hit some of these things, feel free to jump right in. We have kind of a long list of healthcare regulatory areas on the list for today, but we're probably going to spend most of the time talking about 3 or 4 things that are what, in my experience, have been kind of the higher risk bet the company or destroy the company type areas that people can get into in healthcare arena. And to start, I wanted to start with a few. These are facts that I got off the CMS website a few months ago. And I know you guys know most of this stuff, but I just wanted to briefly touch on a couple of these statistics. Over $800 billion spent each year on the Medicare and Medicaid programs. 19% of the total federal budget at this point, and rising. 100 million beneficiaries. Oops, I'm going to have trouble with this, I bet. Every day, Medicare pays over 4 million claims to 1.5 million providers worth of over $1 billion. And they receive 19,000 provider enrollment applications a month. And each year, they're paying out over $430 billion for more than 45 million beneficiaries. Each year, Medicaid, and of course, I think that's on here, there's 56 different Medicaid programs, but they are all subject to federal law. And you all probably know this, but maybe you don't, so I'll just say it. 2/3 roughly of the money for the Medicaid programs comes from the federal government, and 1/3 is contributed through the states. And they're paying over 2.5 billion claims a year. And of course, unless our healthcare reform law gets set aside, which we can talk about that later if you want, but unless that is completely thrown out, the number of people covered under the Medicaid program is going to go up, because part of healthcare reform is to bring a lot more people in. Let's see, I'm sorry if this is jumping around a little bit, just see if I get all the, yeah, that's it. So why do we start here? Well, one of the first topics I want to talk to you about is the risk that you can face in just the simple government payment for your services and supplies area, so the reimbursement area. And the first time I was thinking about this course, I said, well, this is kind of weird because why would you start there as one of the main things for people to be aware of and be careful about? All you're doing is providing a service and sending in a bill for the service. So, you know, in any other arena, you do that, the person gets the bill, they look at it, they say, oh, that's right, and pay it, or they say, no, I didn't order that, I'm not going to pay that. Call you up and, you know, but in the federal healthcare program arena, because of the information we just went through, their attitude is we are helpless to check the claims you send to us. Whatever you send us, we're probably going to pay it. And so it's up to you to make sure that what you send to us is correct. And if you send us an incorrect bill, it's not like a normal business where the recipient of the bill is responsible to look at it and maybe something's wrong here. Let's see. Okay, I guess that's right. You know, maybe be responsible for checking and talking to you about it. They're going to pay the claim, and maybe years later, they're going to say, we shouldn't have paid that. And there's going to be consequences to you or your company on account of that. So what do you think can happen if you send in an incorrect bill? So the least bad thing that can happen, of course, is you would owe the money back. And you know, you think, well, that's fair. I probably wasn't entitled to that money in the first place, so I'll just pay it back. Well, that's true, but you can run into some situations where the entity has gone along billing for what they thought was correctly, and have received lots of money, and it's spent. And now the government is coming back and wanting it all back. Sometimes with interest. One situation that I'm going to share two examples with you. One involved a community hospital out towards Eastern Oregon, and they had, you know, they get paid on a DRG basis. The Medicare reimbursement system is wildly complex, but one of the things it has in it is an annual update factor to the DRG. And it's calculated, very mathematical. The rules go on for pages. That's how you figure this out. And one year, the Medicare program sent them notice, you know, we're updating your DRG in this manner. And they were very diligent. Their CFO always tried to check the numbers and tie it back to their numbers and make sure that it looked right. But this particular year, they had had a flood. So all of the records that he needed, or a lot of them that he needed to check it, were wiped out. But he looked at it and thought, that seems too high. And so he questioned it. And fortunately, there were emails and letters demonstrating that this did occur. And the government said, no, that's right. And so beginning that year, they started to pay, we're talking maybe a 1.5% adjustment. But you know, the cumulative impact of that on your DRG payments across a whole year can add up. And this went on, it rolls forward every year. Every year it's rolling forward. So maybe 6 years down the line, somebody in the carrier's office, I guess it was the intermediary's office, was very diligent, careful, thorough. This woman was very exact, and she discovered a mistake had been made, 6 years prior, and calculated that this hospital, small hospital, owed the government $3.5 million. And we're going to start taking it out of your payments today. So, if you're running an institution and you don't have $3.5 million lying around, this is a crisis. And So, you know, it might seem like, oh, well, if they pay me wrong, I'll just pay them back. But keep in mind that, you know, they're so slow in catching these errors, and some of these errors can be cumulatively over a long period of time quite substantial. Now, in this case, I have to brag a little bit. We were able to come up with a theory under which we successfully convinced the government that because of this particular statute, the way it was worded in terms of calculating the update factor, that the intent of Congress was that at a certain point it would be done and put to rest and we move on and you don't have to worry about it. And so in that one case, we were able to convince them that they actually didn't have grounds to recoup. We didn't have to take it to court. So our hospital they had paid the money because the interest rate that the government wanted to charge if they didn't was exorbitant. So the government actually cut them a check and gave them back the money. But I think that's a very unusual result for a situation where you actually did get an overpayment. Another one, not quite so happy a result, we were representing a medical group that bills, they are not radiologists, but they own the imaging equipment. And so they were billing globally for the technical component, which is the picture, and the professional component, which is the radiologist's interpretation. And then they had a contract with an independent radiology group to do the interpretation. And under the Stark Law, which I understand you guys have looked at, this is allowed, but only if your relationship and arrangements with that radiology group meet the Stark Law requirements. And one of those requirements is that there be a current written signed contract. The contract with the radiology group had expired. Expired, very common, right? You have a contract, it lapses. And it didn't get discovered for a while, and then it got discovered. And the question is, well, what do we do now? Well, of course, as lawyers, we look for any way out. Is there some way we could argue this really was still in effect? And is there anything else that rises to the level of a signed written contract, that sort of thing? But when we ran out of all ideas, at the end of the day, the CFO said, I want to be able to sleep at night. And I know that now I have knowledge that I've got an overpayment. So what do we do? Well, you know, the reality was that as this was going along, the radiologists could have legally billed for the professional component, collected that money directly, no problem, you know, without a contract. And our client could have legally billed for the technical component, collected for that, no problem. And those two payments add up to the exact same amount of money. So we tried to convince the regulator, you know, no harm, no foul. We're disclosing this because we don't want this black cloud hanging over us that you might come try to take all our money back. They said, no, pay it all back. Pay it all back. So the clinic had to pay back all the billings for the radiology tests that it had performed during this, say, 8-month period, and rebill. And so now they're trying to convince the radiologists, you know, that they have to rebill and share the money, and of course the other thing that happens, not to mention the expense of that, but the other thing that happens is that claims start to age out. So, you know, Medicare will come back after you for a very, very extended period of time, but if you discover through that process, oh, I should have billed it differently, well, guess what? If more than a year has gone by, you're not going to be able to. So that's why in this arena, getting your reimbursement right is really crucial, even if there's no issue around some of the things we're going to talk about next. Let's see if I can get my slides here.
Barbara, is
Yeah.
there no statute of limitations on the government coming back and getting money?
Yeah, there is on the, if it's innocent, there's a 4-year timeline you can cite to. if it's, if they're alleging Civil False Claims Act liability, it's 6 years, but then, in my experience, they will assert a 10-year limitation, and if it's criminal fraud, there's no limit. So it's lengthy.
When they apply that, can it be to part of the time frame? So like the house we talked about was 6 years out, but it was non-criminal, but they can only go back 4 if they were able to claim it. Can they go back and say, well, we're just going to get back the
But if they find
finances
something,
before it
can't
gets
they go
voted?
another 4?
Well, so it's quite a complex issue what the exact statute of limitations is. And on the cost reports, you know, for example, so that hospital case involved cost reports, and there is a time frame on which they can't go back on cost reports that have been submitted without fraud. And I think that time frame did protect the hospital. There were a few cost reports that were sealed off because of that, but we were still arguing about another the $3.5 million that had been related to because they were, you know, it was very clear that in that situation that there was no intentional wrongdoing or even negligence on the part of really the negligence was at the intermediary pretty clearly. So, but yeah.
On that second case you were talking about, I'm getting
Yeah.
to more towards the administrative sort of side of things because you work with these folks all the time. But we've talked extensively about Stark and the importance of it.
Yeah.
How in the world does a medical organization allow a contract to lapse, understanding when they're supposed to understand the importance of having that contract in place? Is that just an area in the industry that has not sort of risen up to the level of professionalism one might expect, given the consequences?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think that the awareness of the Stark Law requirements is getting increasingly to the forefront. But I think that, you know, whenever you have something kind of new that comes in, I think people initially have a hard time believing that it's, are you really, seriously, I really have to do this, 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 and this? And then the other thing, and we will talk about the Stark Law, and we could jump to that now, but I think I'll just stick with and we can come back to Stark, but I think that in the real world, the realities that the non-lawyers in the healthcare arena are dealing with sometimes take over. So, you know, I've seen many situations where they're trying to get hospitals, or I'm sorry, physicians to cover the ER or do this or that or the other thing, and it's something they need right now because it's meeting a critical need, and they can't get the contract done for one reason or another. It's not a high enough priority, and the frontline people, what I say is, fine, until there's a contract, you're not doing it, you know, because without the contract, there's all these potential consequences. But I think for the people who are actually trying to run that ER or meet that need, you know, they think, oh, it's a technicality, and we've almost got it done, and we'll follow up and get the paperwork done, and you know, I'm moving forward. And then the other observation I would have on that is that in some areas of the operations, you're talking about a lot of contracts to keep track of. You need a really robust, you know, because like office leases, big one, and you know, those things do expire, and you know, if you've got several hundred of them, who's keeping track of that? And so, but you're right. I mean, it's,
And that's just normally, these organizations don't normally have staff people as a matter of just developing their business. Is that something that's going to sort of, I guess with healthcare reform too, maybe you're going to start having more of these attorneys and CFOs with legal background on staff?
well, yeah, most of the bigger healthcare organizations do have lawyers on staff. And I think most of them are trying to make sure that, you know, they've got operationalized methods for trying to make sure these things are covered. But I think in the real world, sometimes it's easier said than done. I mean, you're right, but I think I don't know what this thing is that keeps popping up here. So, turning to the thing that can often come up when you've billed incorrectly, the Federal False Claims Act can come into play. And this provides recovery of damages and penalties against anyone who knowingly causes to be presented a false or fraudulent claim for payment, knowingly causes to be made a false record to get a false claim paid, or conspires to defraud the government. And, you know, this sounds like, oh, I would never do that, that's so criminal. But actually, the standards are not as high as it might sound. So if you intentionally or recklessly overstate or upcode, systematic or repeated duplicate billing, these are just examples. There's millions of ways that this can come into play. Unbundling or falsifying information in the medical record to justify a claim. And they only have to prove that you were deliberately doing something by a preponderance of the evidence to prove their case. So it's not a criminal standard where it's beyond a reasonable doubt. It's much lower. And they will make these allegations if they see a pattern, if something happens repeatedly. They're not going to do it if it's once or twice. But if there's an incorrect coding or billing thing that's going on over a long period of time, most likely this is going to come into play. And so you're going to be, right off the bat, you're going to be talking about more than just paying the government back. They're going to be saying it's going to take more than that. And the really scary thing about the False Claims Act is that even though it's not criminal, the penalties that go with it are so draconian, in some cases, that the impact can be essentially the same as, or even worse than having a criminal charge. So 3 times the amount of the false claims submitted, a civil penalty of $5,500 to $11,000 per claim, and so if you have a claim form with 6 line items, that's 6 claims. And payment of their costs, they can recover their costs of going after you, and then also if you're found to have violated the False Claims Act, then they can exclude you from federal health care programs, which for most health care providers is essentially a death sentence. There are lots of other false claims authorities besides the False Claims Act. These are just a few of them. The civil monetary penalties law is the one. It has provisions that are kind of similar to the False Claims Act and what it prohibits, but this is the one that also prohibits paying any incentives to reduce care. So that statute is the one that makes it very difficult for hospitals, for example, to enter into financial relationships with physicians that would allow them to share the savings from implementing a new cost-saving procedure or something like that. If they want to try to get doctors on the same page in terms of bringing down costs by saying, oh, we'll give you some of the money that results, the statute usually makes it illegal to do that. And then there's a whole bunch of other ones. State law, people sometimes forget we do have state laws that can come into play in healthcare. In addition, the False Claims Act has, and Rick told me you've talked some about the key TAM law, and what this does is it allows a person to bring a claim on behalf of himself, herself, and the government. So they're standing in on behalf of the government, but if they win, they get 15 to 30% of the recovery. And there are many, many examples of whistleblowers in healthcare and other actually like defense contractor whistleblowers that have literally hit the jackpot, $100 million kind of thing from their share of a key TAM litigation recovery. Now, those big numbers are not the average run-of-the-mill case, but even just an average run-of-the-mill case can yield, several $100,000 to the whistleblower. So it draws a lot of interest. The statute also provides protection for employees who bring False Claims Act claims from any adverse employment action. So if you're the lucky hospital that has a disgruntled employee who's decided to bring a whistleblower claim and you find out that they've sicked the government on you, you have to handle that person with absolute kid gloves, or you are going to be looking at another lawsuit. And so I wanted to tell you a story. Well, here, let me just finish these slides. There's a law term called relator, which means the whistleblower. They have to be the first to file in order to recover. They have to be the original source of the information. And this kind of comes into play when you're thinking about what to do if you've discovered a problem, because you may be in a race with one or more potential whistleblowers in your organization to disclose the problem. And the other, in this I'll share some experiences with this last bullet point in a second. The complaint, these whistleblower key town litigations, they get filed under seal, which means that it's a secret. The only people who know this lawsuit is pending is the plaintiff, and of course the plaintiff's lawyer, and the judge. But the defendant named in the lawsuit doesn't know what's going on. And so the plaintiff files the complaint with the court. The U.S. attorney gets a copy, and then they have 60 days to decide whether to intervene or not, which means they take over the case, they investigate it, they develop it. Well, what they do typically is they get that 60 days extended again and again and again. So you'll have a client that's under investigation in connection with a whistleblower case for years, and you don't know it. They haven't told you that you're a defendant in the case. So it's an interesting arena. And I'm going to share a story with you. This remains to this day one of the more dramatic things I've been involved in my career. We got a call several years ago from a hospital administrator of a small rural hospital in Oregon that will remain nameless, even though some of this was in the press at the time. And he had been told that he was under investigation by the government. And I have in the stack of stuff I gave you, oh wait, I guess I'm going out of order here. Sorry, I forgot about some things that but we'll come back to that stuff. So in the stack I gave you, if you look down several pages, I'm looking at this letter from the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice Medicaid Fraud Unit is actually an Oregon agency, but it's funded by the federal government, and it's kind of an odd agency because they report to the Oregon Attorney General and to the U.S. Attorney's Office. So they're dual reporting to both the state and federal fraud enforcers. And so this hospital, this was addressed to the hospital. Dear hospital, as you are aware, there is an ongoing coordinated investigation into your billings to state and federal funded healthcare programs. The entities involved in this effort include the FBI, the Office of Inspector General of the United States, the Oregon U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit. The fact that all of these entities are involved is not unusual. We have generally found that providers prefer to deal with us all at once. Reassuring? Reassuring. Yeah, I will say that is unusual, and that's a scary letter to get. And then they go on in the next paragraph to remind them, this hospital, that you are required to cooperate with us, and if you don't, that's another reason we can come after you. But if you insist, in the third paragraph, we are prepared to utilize other available forms of process to obtain the records. And then notice here they warn the hospital that you're on notice to preserve the records that relate to this investigation. So but this is basically all the hospital knew at this point. And so we started, trying to gather information, interview people, figure out what was going on, respond to a lengthy request for documents, which is also next couple pages down. You'll see that the government asked the hospital to give them all sorts of stuff. And, it's not easy to collect all this stuff. The first couple pages give you all the rules of how you're to handle documents and what's included. And then it goes into what's being asked for. But we could see, we're trying to divine from what the government was asking for, what the issues might be, and what we needed to, prepare to defend and try to get our arms around in terms of what could they possibly have done that, could have caused this to happen. And they're asking for lots of information about the charge master, all the physicians, number 7, a complete list of all physicians who worked in the emergency room for a 6-year period. So that was interesting. You're wondering, what could be going on there, and some other kinds of information that were being requested. So we're going along, gathering this and trying to respond to these requests. And the way you do this is you take the list and you work with the people at the hospital who have access to the records, and you make copies of everything, and then you number everything. And then your plan is to give numbered copies to the U.S. attorney or the Medicaid fraud people, so that you know what you've given them, and you have proof later if you need it of what you've given them. And also the hospital continues to have its copies for its operations, because a lot of times this stuff is stuff they need on a daily basis. And so we're doing that. We're working with various people at the hospital to gather the information. And the next thing we know, we get a call. The FBI has arrived about 8 o'clock at night with a truck, and they're there to execute on a subpoena. They were raiding the hospital to collect records. And what we found out was that it had been alleged that they were in the process of destroying documents. And so what this does to your civil investigation, which believe me is bad enough, is it turns it into a criminal case. So all of a sudden, we had been working with the U.S. attorney who handles civil healthcare fraud. We were now moved to the office of the guy who does the criminal stuff. And we didn't know why. So, but at this point, the one good thing that came out of this was that the veil started to part a little bit, because in connection with this, we got the affidavit. I did not put the affidavit in your materials, partly because I want to kind of try to preserve the anonymity of the client. Even though some of this was public, it's kind of bad to have your name dragged back through the mud over and over. But an FBI agent had sworn out an affidavit claiming that they had a confidential source inside the hospital telling them that this, and this had happened. And, they were quoting conversations that had allegedly gone on between the CFO and our associate who was there trying to collect the records. And you don't realize how other people are going to be looking at things, but she would say, okay, I need the minutes for the board for the last 6 years, and he would say, well, let me go through that and get the relevant stuff and give it to you. Well, if you're on a trustworthy level with your client, that's fine. He's trying to cut down on his legal costs, basically. He doesn't want somebody who's going to bill him a couple $100 an hour to sit there and read through all the minutes. The whistleblower, the confidential source, says, aha, the CFO is going to pull out everything that is suspicious and cart it off and burn it up. And so there were, multiple examples of allegations of that type that were in this affidavit. And, we managed to put the genie back in the bottle real quick. We went to the U.S. Attorney and said, this is clearly a misunderstanding. Come on out to the hospital. You can interview anybody you want. They'll answer any questions. And one of the things that did come out in the course of it was that while all this was going on, someone who was not aware of the investigation had sent an email about routine document destruction protocols. And somehow that had also come to the attention of the U.S. Attorney, and they believed that this showed something. So that person got interviewed and said, oh yeah, that's what this is about. And they're like, oh, sorry. So
So what happened that night when the FBI was there to get the documents?
Yeah, so they come in with their subpoena, and they did claim that they tried to come after hours so that it would be less disruptive to the patients and so forth. And but yeah, they went around. They said, I need your file cabinet of all your physician recruiting agreements. I need all your leases. I need your charge master they had this long list, and the people have to go around and give them the documents.
Execute them.
Yeah, well, yeah, they executed on the warrant. They took a whole truckload of documents away that night. And of course, the bad thing about that is you don't know what they've got. You don't have a copy of what they took. So from a lawyer's defense counsel standpoint, it's not a good situation. Because there could be something in there you might need to explain. You never know. But you won't, if you don't have a chance to look at it, you don't know what it is.
So, I assume these are all business documents. Can they do the same thing with healthcare records?
They can.
Doesn't it jeopardize patient care?
Well, they wouldn't, I don't think they would take active patient records. Yeah, that would be, they're kind of sensitive to that. I mean, they don't want to be, able to be charged with having, caused, they don't like bad publicity either. So, anyway, so this story isn't over yet. Sorry, it's a long story.
It's a great story.
So this case is going on, and they're getting a little more specific with us, and we're working hard with the business office manager, the CFO, and a few other people to develop the information. So we're doing computer runs on different billing issues. We're looking at the problems with the physicians in the ER. We're trying to quantify. We're now trying to put dollar signs around if there were billing errors. How much are we talking about, and that kind of thing. And we've been bugging the government lawyers to give us a copy of the complaint, because we had still not seen what the lawsuit was about. They were refusing to give us the complaint. And we were saying, look, this is ridiculous. We've got to know specifically what we're charged with so we can investigate it. So one day they sent over a copy of the complaint, and it was heavily redacted, which means a lot of it's blanked out. In fact, a lot of the allegations were blanked out, which is kind of, frustrating. But one thing they didn't blank out was the name of the whistleblower. So the government lawyers made a boo-boo.
Yeah.
And I looked at the name, and it was the guy we were working with. So this is why this is one of the most dramatic things that's ever happened to me as a lawyer, because I knew right away that we were in deep trouble from an ethical standpoint. The person who was the confidential source was the business manager for the hospital. And he was the one that was helping us try to figure out how to quantify the billing problems. He was the one that was suggesting how we would go about finding out where the issues were. And he had also been very, very helpful in suggesting some additional things we might want to look into. So, little light bulb. So, you know, we looked at it, and I have a partner who he was actually he was a U.S. attorney, so that's kind of helpful. So he was, you know, pretty familiar with what was. So I said, well, I think we pick up the phone right now and call the client. And he said, well, you know, we probably need to give the government a few hours notice. So I think this might have happened in the middle of the day or something. We sent an email or a letter, I can't remember which, to the U.S. Attorney's Office and said, we have this information, we're calling the client tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the morning. And of course, they went into overdrive. You cannot do that, you know. And so they set up a hearing with the federal judge to talk about whether or not we could tell our client. And you know, at the beginning, it looked kind of like the judge was going to say no, because, of course, revealing the name of the whistleblower is kind of dramatic. It's not supposed to happen. But I was in a position, I felt like, well, we can't keep working with this guy. So if we can't, you know, if we can't reveal the name of the whistleblower, we'll have to withdraw from the case. And you know, this happens sometimes in criminal cases where lawyers withdraw without saying why. So we would have to just tell the client, sorry, you've spent, you know, 6 figures on our legal fees, and we know all the stuff about the case, and you really need us to stay in, but we're withdrawing. So that was one possibility, and so I had kind of decided, no, I'll be telling the client who this is. And of course then, for me, that could be contempt of court if the judge said, don't do it. So it was a very tense hearing for us. But after we explained all the facts, see, I think that maybe the judge didn't realize the central role that this guy was playing in the case on behalf of the client. And you know, there was a serious issue about breach of attorney-client privilege here, because you know, he has a lawyer who is suing my client, and he's talking to me about our case strategy. And most likely he's telling his lawyer. So that, from the standpoint of the hospital, is a terrible breach of their attorney-client privilege. And unfortunately, I mean, we were not saying, well, how are we going to cover this up? But we were trying to develop defenses and theories as to why some of this stuff was fine or not as serious as what the government was trying to make it seem like. So it was a very, very tense situation. Ultimately, the hospital, we convinced the hospital, there were a few things that they did wrong. One of the things that they did wrong was in the ER, it was a hassle to get new physicians a billing number from the government in a timely way. It took a long time. And they had an ER staffing situation where people would come in and they'd be there just a short period of time, and then they'd never come back again. So they got in the habit, some administrator, and you think, well, how could they not? Well, somebody in the ER administration discovered that if we just bill everybody under the name of the ER medical director, that works pretty good. You know, the claims go through quickly, and we don't, you know, we don't have to apply for all these numbers. So, you know, and you're all sophisticated. You're going, oh God, why would they do that? But they did. They did do that, and you know, but it wasn't like they were billing for services that hadn't been provided. It was, you know, they billed it under the wrong doctor's number. So we had to come up with, you know, and of course the government people, they'd sit down across the table from you and they'd say, well, you know, that really is a false claim. I'd say, yeah, we know, but you know, it's kind of different from from a double charging or a fake, you know, fake charges. So cut us a break. So this is kind of how your negotiation goes. So we were able to convince the government to let the hospital return a very modest amount of money, and they closed the case, and the whistleblower really didn't get anything out of it. But the case wasn't over yet because the business manager was still an employee at the hospital. And you remember what I said about the whistleblower protection? Well, you know, it's one thing to say we're going to follow the law, we're not going to retaliate, but this guy's boss, his name had been drug all over the affidavit that the FBI agent had sworn out as accusing him of, you know, destroying documents and doing things that were fraudulent, you know, by name. My boss is doing this, 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 and that was in this affidavit. And so it was almost impossible for him to not start looking at this guy in a completely different way and perceiving that his performance was below par and, you know, that we needed to get him out of there. Well, of course, that's another lawsuit for the hospital.
Couldn't have ground, I don't know anything about legal issues, but they couldn't terminate him because of, I guess, like violating their attorney-client privilege?
If we could have proved that, yeah. But, you know, that would have required proof of what he said to his lawyer. So we felt that most likely he had breached it. But, you know, his lawyers we're never going to be able to put him on the stand or examine him on that because it's a privilege. So it's, yeah, I mean, you would think, but no. And so we had that lawsuit to deal with. And then there was one more, which was that the physician whose name was used on the ER claims sued. He had a theory that it was defamatory and put him in a bad light with Medicare and a couple of other creative theories, and that was another lawsuit. So by the time the hospital got done with that, you know, they were pretty well in shell shock, and you know, it's very disruptive and very what do I want to say? Time-consuming, expensive, and draining for the people who are involved in it. I had one thing here I wanted to share from an article that was written at the time, if I can find it quickly.
So Barbara?
Yeah.
So if you're in a position in an organization and you see that something, that incorrect billing is taking place and you have authority over, you could correct that incorrect billing, you have the choice, right? You can either correct the billing in compliance with the obligations of your position within that organization, or you can key tam.
That's true.
I mean, this is bizarre.
It is bizarre, and there's no, and let's see, I did give you guys in the, sorry, I'm not totally organized here, but in this stack of stuff I gave you a few pages on key tam, and if you page down a couple, what these are, this is from this one here, whistleblowers, this one. I printed this off the web, and it's from a whistleblower lawyer that I had some personal experience with. And you see here he says, never try to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig. And what this is his response to the question of, I found something going on where I work. Should I tell my employer? Should I bring it forward and try to get them to fix it or not? And his answer is, never try to teach a pig to sing. So what he's basically saying is, come to me. Keep it quiet, come to me.
Now let's see, who's the pig?
The pig would be the employer.
I'm saying.
Oh, who's the pig? This guy, as far as I'm concerned. I have a certain perspective.
Why couldn't the hospital say, we were not aware this was happening, but the business manager was aware? And
Yeah.
let it happen?
Yeah, on some of these things, you know, you
Does KETAM protect you from that aspect of it?
no. I mean, if you have I think what you're saying is if there's an employee, one person in the organization who's doing something improper and they know it, can that prevent the whole organization from being liable for a key TAM? No, but if you can really show that that's what happened, they'll, they have a range here, 1 to 3 times, and 5,500 to 11. So they have flexibility. They also have flexibility in deciding what they're going to leave in the case. So in our case, there were, it's like kind of like throwing spaghetti at the wall. This was the whistleblower, see what sticks. Well, most of it fell off after, because they'd look at it and say, yeah, but that's not worth pursuing. But I mean, usually it's usually not that limited to just one person, and in this case, there were different departments in the hospital that had things alleged about what they were doing that was improper. So, but this this website, if you page down with the next page, he's giving them tips on how to prepare their case. And if you look at item number 3, it just shows you that this possibility of suing for adverse employment action, they're planning on it from the beginning. So he says, before you report the fraud, copy your personnel file so that, we can come back later and bring the discrimination lawsuit or the retaliation lawsuit.
Barbara, is it influential if you already had documented the subpar performance? Is that influential in the end then about potentially being able to fire them?
It's very difficult. Very difficult. I mean, if it was 100% clear that he was already, and frankly, there was an element of that in this case where part of the reason that he might have been willing to get involved in the whistleblower case was he was kind of in trouble at work. So it's like, well, what am I going to do for money? Well, but it's still, if you haven't already fired him, it's going to be tough.
So on the one hand, like the financial incentive is what's going to lead people to try to find ways to find something out that's wrong and get some money. But on the other hand, if we get rid of the financial incentive, then real whistleblowers who really find things,
yes.
I mean, there is going to be some element of that. But
yes. I have a very skewed view, and I'm so glad you brought this up. There are courageous whistleblowers in the world who are recovering millions of dollars, on behalf of all of us by coming forward. And I'm just saying, from the standpoint of where most of you guys are probably headed, you just need to be aware that there are snakes in the grass. there are really snakes. We actually, one class that we had here, there was a guy who shared a really interesting experience he had. I think he had been an independent auditor. He'd been brought in to do an audit of some, I can't remember what, some healthcare hospital billing or something. And he said he found some serious problems and wrote it up in his report and turned it in. He thought, wow, this is really bad. He said within 2 days, he had a letter from the hospital's lawyer saying, thank you very much, we're going to take care of this right away, and let me remind you that under your consulting agreement, you're bound by confidentiality. Because, he's a potential whistleblower. He's been hired to see what's going on. He goes in and finds what's going on. If they don't nip it in the bud and step forward and say, we're the ones who are going to be addressing this and disclosing it as required, you have created potential whistleblower. And so, when you're in your business environment and you have people bringing up concerns or issues, you can't just say, oh, don't worry about that. Because if they're one of these zealous types, you've just given them a open book to just go all that hot line.
Can a confidentiality agreement, that can't stop him from reporting a book, right?
No.
If it's something illegal.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can do what you can.
He could step back and see if they really do something about it or not.
I think, going back to this point about, the business manager being the one who's involved and so forth, where you can, to some degree, protect yourself is if you have policies that clearly say, if you have a culture of compliance and you have a policy that says if you find anything, you can report to here, you can report to here. If you're concerned about reporting to this person, you can go here. And then addressing those issues, thoroughly investigating them, documenting them. Then if you get in a situation where you have someone who chooses to go straight to the government and you have this track record, you can say, you know, really you're dealing with somebody who's just out for a buck and, you know, you should cut us a break. And a lot of time, I mean, I think a lot of the government lawyers are not really that interested in going after healthcare providers that are doing their best to comply. I mean, of course, it's all in your perspective, but you know, I mean, I know in the case I've been talking about that they were quite concerned about the fact that they were dealing with the only hospital in a big area. It's a nonprofit organization. You know, I did attend a CLE, it was a kind of a continuing legal education event about 6 or so months ago, and the FBI agent on the case was a speaker. And she was doing this, what we're doing now, really to the nines, because she was going through all kinds of prior examples of things that she had dealt with. But she came to our case, and you know, she made it sound like that they had really bent over backwards to be nice to the hospital. So this is where she brought up the fact that they came in at, you know, after hours, and that they knew that, you know, she said that people were saying to her, you mean we're going to do an FBI raid on a hospital that actually did provide the services? So that they were onto this ER stuff at that point. The services were actually provided, but, you know, there's some technical glitches, and we're actually going to go do an FBI raid. And she said, yep. And then she said that they discovered that, you know, it was all an innocent mistake, and they drove the documents right back. And I'm like, that's not the way I remember it. That's not the way I remember it. But anyway.
So, I may have missed this in the dialogue, but if a process is occurring and you're part of that process and you know it's wrong and you address it and it doesn't get corrected, and then eventually you say, you know what, I've had enough, and you are the whistleblower,
Mm-hmm.
Are you then exempt?
Exempt from what?
Any prosecution because you were part of the problem?
Yes. Usually they're not going to, but so what it can do is it can have an impact on how much money you get.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, there was that range. If the whistleblower was involved, you're probably down to the lower end of the range. So, and you know, at some point they might say, you know, you did it. We're not, you know, you can't, we're not going to. But the issues around whistleblower recovery are kind of, there's a lot of case law on when you can recover, what the bars to recovery are, that kind of thing.
Sure, you know, in the middle of everything you get caught in between stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that there are times when judgments do have to be made in some areas as to how far you're going to go in dotting the I's and crossing the T's, and so, you know, I think it's not easy. Yeah.
So OHSU had a similar issue a while back where nursing staff was stating that something was a stat, needed to be done stat. And so they would tell the provider, whether that be x-ray tech, phlebotomist, whoever, doctor wants a stat. So then they would document it, oh, it needs to be done stat. And they would then charge the patient stat. But nobody was questioning the nurse to say, was there a written order for it to be done stat? Until Medicare noted that there were a lot of these urgent stat charges on floors where patients weren't talking like transplant or intense,
Acute
like family,
acute care floors.
not the acute care floors. So these are just regular immunology floors, regular floors where people were just getting normal care done. And until they did a big investigation and they found that there was millions of dollars of fraudulent claims. And so what's interesting to me is that there wasn't any education to the nursing staff after that, because I was a floor staff person at the time. And there was very little education about reminders. When you verbally give an order to somebody, make sure that you're stating it correctly. So that was interesting, that the follow-up from that. I know that OHSU ended up negotiating because it wasn't done, it wasn't done to make money.
Right,
It was
it's not
done
like the nurses were profiting from the
Right,
stat orders.
exactly, right, right.
But
So
still.
it was, yeah, so it was one of those things that, I think that was one of the interesting things. I was wondering if the facility that, did they change how they do?
Oh,
their-
yeah.
Like, I'm wondering, like, did it go across the board where from now on, if, anything that comes of this, and then there's like a learning or teaching method for
Yes,
it?
well, on the ER doctors, they get the numbers, there's.
Because I know, because residents, when they rotate out to rural sites, I would assume, because they're only there for 4 weeks.
It's the same problem probably. By the time they can get paid, they're gone.
Right. So I'm curious how they handle that. Like, how
Yeah.
do they change? It's not like the government's going to change to make it easier for you.
No, no. No, I think, and again, I haven't dealt with this particular billing issue on an operational level, since our case, but I think the way that works is you have your claims, you wait till you get your number and then you submit your claims, and as long as you get them in before the year, you can get paid. It's just way delayed, which is
You just have to hold them until they
until
get
you
the
get your
number to bill.
number. Yeah, so it's kind of lame, but yeah, there was. I just wanted to share this with you. So it's kind of beating a dead horse here, but there was an article. This was a public case to some extent, and so there was an article with the hospital's name on it, and they quoted the FBI affidavit. The president's secretary allegedly was actively destroying electronic files relevant to this investigation and destroyed computer files specifically involved in the billing problems. So it sounds like Watergate, right? And this is all coming from this confidential source and then being quoted as a fact by the FBI agent. Anyway, I won't go back over all that, but I think there's this one thing here I thought they, and then the pundits, of course, we're in there, we know what's going on, but all these lawyers are willing to give their opinions. And they're saying, oh, you really should have policies and you have to be careful about. Well, the minute we got involved in the case, we had sent a memo to everybody who was involved, not everybody in the hospital, but everybody who's involved with the documents. Don't destroy any documents. But